And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan De Silva. On this week's episode, Charles Lloyd, His Life and Times and Best Hits. Charles Lloyd was one of the best saxophonists of his generation. He was also an avid flutist. His work in the jazz fusion movement, bridging the gap between folk, rock and so forth, established him as a pioneer in jazz. He started out touring and performing in Memphis with musicians like Howlin' Wolf and B.B. King, then started out as a jazz artist. He started out performing alongside the Chico Hamilton's band in Los Angeles in the late 60s. He then led his own quartet, notably featuring pianist Keith Jarrett. His music revolutionized the West Coast jazz scene. His albums featuring himself as a saxophonist established him as a leading tenor saxophonist of his time, with his blend of lyrics and spirituality and warm style of playing. Albums like Lovin', Forest Flower and The Water is Wide. So that's some insight into the life and times and best hits of Charles Lloyd. More details coming up. Also coming up, some trending festival and album news. Stay tuned to the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan De Silva to find out more. We'll be right back after some music. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan De Silva. On this week's episode, Charles Lloyd, His Life and Times and Best Hits. During this hour, we're going to be talking about his biography. Charles Lloyd was born in Tennessee in 1938. Memphis has a rich river culture and musical heritage that's saturated in blues, gospel and jazz. Charles Lloyd took the saxophone at age 9. He was primarily inspired by the music of Lester Young, Charlie Parker, Coleman Hawkins and Billie Holiday. His first saxophone mentor was the great pianist Phineas Newborn. As a child, he would practice alongside Brooker Little, who also went on to become a big name in the music scene in later years. As a teenager, Lloyd would tour alongside names like George Coleman, Johnny Ace, Howlin' Wolf and B.B. King. Lloyd was also drawn to classical music. In 1956, he took up studying music in university. He'd play in Los Angeles jazz clubs alongside Ornette Coleman, Billy Higgins, Scott LaFaro, Eric Dolphy and others. He was also a member of the Jerry Wilson Band. In 1960, he took up work as a music director for Chico Hamilton's band. Two of Hamilton's most iconic albums, Passin' Through and Man from the Woods, features music written almost entirely by Lloyd. He was at a time when he was both finding his niche as a saxophonist and a prolific composer. In 1964, Lloyd joined the Cannonball Adderley Sextet. He performed alongside names like Nat Adderley, Sam Jones and others. In 1965, he started out forming a quartet of his own, featuring world-class talents like pianist Keith Jarrett, drummer Jack DeJohnette and bassist Cecil McBee. Their first recordings were the albums Dreamweaver and Forest Flower live at Monterey. The album Forest Flower went down in history as the first jazz album to sell over 1 million copies. The Lloyd Quartet were also the first jazz group to appear on the famous Film Auditorium in San Francisco, where they performed alongside musicians like Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin and others. In 1967, Lloyd was named Jazz Artist of the Year by Downbeat magazine. The same year, his quartet toured the world. They toured in venues like the Montreux Jazz Festival at Antibes and other venues where they received a very warm reception. Charles Lloyd was famous for blending various influences in his music. He would say his music danced on many shows, and as such, his quartet were often credited with being pioneers of what was known as the world music movement at the time. From the get-go, Charles Lloyd was very innovative with his music. His compositions and performances have traversed the post-pop period, embraced the traditional, and re-envisioned the psychedelic 60s with avant-garde improvisation. He also became the first jazz musician to perform at the Classical Music Festival in Bergen in Norway. In 1970, at the peak of his career, Charles Lloyd dropped out of the limelight for a while and started out on a journey of introspection in the famous terrain of Big Sur in California. The beautiful local had often been a haunt for many other musicians seeking the same solace, musicians like Henry Miller, Jack Kerouac and Robinson Jeffers. During this time, he made a few appearances into the music scene. One notable stint was alongside the Beach Boys on a couple of studio albums and during some live tours. In 1981, after nearly a decade of silence, Charles Lloyd made a reappearance into the jazz scene after a chance encounter with up-and-coming French pianist Michael Petrucciani. Lloyd felt compelled to introduce his music to the world. So in the early 1980s, Lloyd embarked upon a series of world tours in Japan, Europe and USA alongside Petrucciani on piano. According to critics, Lloyd's return to the jazz scene in the 1980s was one of the big events of the 80s. Together they also produced some great albums like Night Blooming Jasmine and Montreux 82. In 1988, Lloyd formed a new quartet with pianist Bobo Stetson. In 1989, he signed up with ECM Records where he made his debut album on the label. The project saw a new era of Lloyd's compositions and recordings. According to critics, his music re-envisioned the sense of music at the time. He toured and performed actively with the ECM label from 1989. His playing had turned a new chapter, as evident in his recordings for ECM, The Art of Ballad Playing. Some of his best albums for ECM included Lift Every Voice, Canto, Voice in the Night and others. His music with ECM was hallmarked by a lot of creativity and spirituality. One of his albums alongside his new quartet, Mirror, became a hit album that's been called Charles Lloyd's classic album. Another album, Robot de Noob, was a great live album that was voted #1 at the 2008 Jazz Times Readers and Critics poll. Lloyd's quartet performances were often hailed for their deep emotion and passion that touched the listeners' hearts. Charles Lloyd remains an active musician in the jazz scene. He also tours and performs at venues around the world. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan De Silva. On this week's episode, Charles Lloyd, His Life and Times and Best Hits. Now is some trending album news. Carl Latham is a very versatile jazz drummer, and he's just out with a new album called Living Standards 2. This album is a compilation of jazz renditions of great pop and rock hits. His previous album, Living Standards, was released in 2016 to massive success. On this album, we see Latham collaborating with long-standing bandmates bassist Mark Egan and renowned guitarist Mitch Steen. Mitch Steen's collaborated in the past with names like the Brecker Brothers, David Sanborn and others. There's also renowned percussionist Roger Squirtero. Also leading keyboardist Henry Hay. He's collaborated with David Bowie and Bill Evans in his time. So this album brings together a mashup of vintage rock and pop classics covered with jazz themes. And here's some of the hit songs from the album. Crosby, Still, Nash & Young's Carry On, Buffalo Springfield's Rock and Roll Woman, and Steppenwolf's Magic Carpet Ride. You can purchase the album Living Standards 2 at carllatham.com. So that was some trending album news on the Weekend Jazz Update with Joshani Silva. We're going for a short break. We'll be right back after that. When we come back, we're going to be talking about some of Charles Lloyd's best albums of all time. Stay tuned. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Joshani Silva. On this week's episode, Charles Lloyd, His Life and Times and Best Hits. During this hour, we're going to be talking about some of his best albums of all time. Here's a quick recap of what's coming up. The first album is called Forest Flower. This one was released in 1967. This album was recorded during a live performance at the Monterey Jazz Festival. The Charles Lloyd Quartet is seen here at the peak of their powers, exhibiting all the flair and majesty that made them a mainstay. Also, Charles Lloyd was one of the revolutionaries of jazz at the time. He was one of the pioneers of the jazz fusion movement. And on this tour also, there's elements of jazz fusion in the music. Classics like East of the Sun, Sorcery and Voice in the Night. Overall, this album totally encapsulates the spirit of jazz in the 60s. The Water is Wide was released in 2000. There's a beautiful lineup on the performances, from John Abercrombie to Billy Higgins to Larry Grenadier. This album is basically a mashup of some of Charles Lloyd's favorite classics like Song of Her and Lady Day. And The Sky Will Still Be There Tomorrow. This one's a very reflective album from his compilation. This album traverses the themes of a search for a deeper meaning, themes like wisdom, reason and comfort. Some of the top tracks include The Ghost of Lady Day, Beyond Darkness, Sky Valley, Spirit of the Forest and the title track. The music is overall lush and introspective. So that was a quick recap of the albums that we're going to be discussing during this hour, and this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Joshani Silva. We're going for a short break. We'll be right back after that. Stay tuned. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Joshani Silva. On this week's episode, Charles Lloyd, His Life and Times and Best Hits. During this hour, we're going to be talking about some of his best albums of all time. The first one's called Forest Flower, released in 1967. This album was recorded during a live performance at the Monterey Jazz Festival. The Charles Lloyd Quartet is seen here at the peak of their powers, exhibiting all the flair and majesty that made them a mainstay. The title track is outstanding. It's separated into two parts, Sunset and Sunrise, and sees a stellar cast performing it. Charles Lloyd, Keith Jarrett, Cecil McBee and Jack DeJohnette. The beauty of the lyrics is also outstanding. Keith Jarrett's one of the highlights on the song with his dynamic piano playing. The music is very fresh and novel, and legend has it that Miles Davis came to know about this band after this performance. He was deeply moved by Lloyd's sound and energy on this tour and went on to recruit two of the quartet band members on the strength of that performance, Jack DeJohnette and Keith Jarrett. Also, Charles Lloyd was one of the revolutionaries of jazz at the time. He was one of the pioneers of the jazz fusion movement. And on this tour, there's also elements of jazz fusion in the songs, rock influences on some, and some of them like Sombrero Sam, also in the rhythms of DeJohnette and Jarrett's playing style. Other great songs include classics like East of the Sun, Sorcery and Voice in the Night. Charles Lloyd on saxophone is very similar to John Coltrane's style of playing. Overall, this album totally encapsulates the spirit of jazz in the 60s. The Water is Wide was released in 2000. Story goes that at the time, everybody who was collaborating on this recording was very busy, so it took a while for Charles Lloyd to organize the final studio session in 1999. And there's a beautiful lineup on the performances. There's John Abercrombie and Billy Higgins, stars from the Voice in the Night album, with pianist Brad Mehldau and bassist Larry Grenadier being new to the arena. The chemistry between them is spectacular. Mehldau's nostalgic, brooding piano perfectly complements Charles Lloyd's similar saxophone style, especially on the track Ballad and Allegro, where Mehldau's piano seamlessly synchronizes with the polished saxophone chimes of Charles Lloyd. Many of the tracks on the album are in like vein. Some faster pieces like Figure in Blue, an original composition by Lloyd, and a Billy Strayhorn composition, Lotus Blossom. There's also a mashup of some Charles Lloyd favorites like Song of Her and Lady Day. Lloyd was known for a gentle, mystic saxophone style, and that's one characteristic of this album. His gentle intensity is best seen on the song The Monk and the Mermaid, while the spiritual aspect of his playing comes across on There Is Balm in Gilead. This is one of his best albums for ECM Records. The Sky Will Still Be There Tomorrow was released in 2024. This is Lloyd's 11th studio album for Blue Note Records, came on top of other great albums like Vanished Gardens. Basically, this album traverses the themes of questions, introspection and conflict in various forms. Some of the themes, wisdom, reason and comfort. Lloyd's playing has a tinge of humaneness in his sound, characteristic of his playing, a very reflective album from his compilation. The album starts off with the peppy, defiant Tender Warrior, which sets the scene for this album, and the song The Sky Will Still Be There Tomorrow takes up the pace from there. Lloyd is joined on the tracks by pianist Jason Moran, bassist Larry Grenadier and drummer Brian Blade. The backdrop instrumentals are gentle and rollicking while Lloyd alternates between soft gentle playing and peppy dynamic notes, navigating the piece to its stunning conclusion. Another classic called The Lonely One, typically played out as a soft nostalgic piece, this song is portrayed with a lot of vitality here, while still retaining its reflective essence. A peppy dance song called Monk Dance, on which Brian Blade and Jason Moran are especially dynamic on piano and drums. The Water is Rising, by contrast, is a heartwarming, moving song. Lloyd's joyful flute music is a standout feature here. Other great pieces from the quartet include The Ghost of Lady Day, Beyond Darkness, Sky Valley, Spirit of the Forest, and the title track. The music is overall lush and introspective. Larry Grenadier is solid and rhythmic on bass, holding the performance together. Moran and Blade are the driving force of the music, adding momentum to the music with their playing. Lloyd's saxophone playing is nostalgic and dreamy. Overall, a great relaxing compilation of music. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashani Silva. On this week's episode, Charles Lloyd, His Life and Times and Best Hits. Now it's time for some trending album news. Back in 1972, acclaimed jazz pianist Marian McPartland performed between an intimate crowd of fans in Long Island, New York. The concert recording went undiscovered for 40 years. It's just been unearthed and it's set to be released on Liberation Records on April 11th this year. So Marian McPartland was a visionary pianist from the jazz genre. She recorded over 40 acclaimed albums for Savoy Records, Capitol Records and Concord Records. She's collaborated with several other jazz greats from Tony Bennett to Elvis Costello. So the compilation of music in At the Peninsula Library 1972 was recorded before a live concert on December 10, 1972 in New York City. A 78-minute performance featuring collaborating musicians bassist Rusty Gilder and drummer Joe Costello. Some of the songs performed include jazz classics like Stella by Starlight, A Night in Tunisia, Satin Doll and others. Now, for the very first time since 40 years, this concert performance is up for sale. You can pre-order the digital album online for $14.99. For more information, please visit marianmcpartlandlive.bandcamp.com. So that was some trending album news on the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashani Silva. We're going for a short break. We'll be right back after that. When we come back, we're going to be talking about some of Charles Lloyd's best albums of all time. Stay tuned.